Good afternoon. I'm Chris Hurlstone. I'm Technical Director at Team Consulting, and this lunchtime talk is to do with selecting and collaborating with manufacturing partners to achieve successful product launch. Contents, I want to talk a little bit first about the device development process and then talk about some of the key relationships during that process, and then move on little section on CMO selection, and then main part of the talk is thinking about who does what when, which are the different organisations are responsible for which activities during the development process, and then a little summary at the end, and hopefully a bit of time for some Q&A. So this is device development process. You'll see it in a number of different forms. These are common phases and stage descriptions. It's in line with 13485 7.3 design controls, but really starting with design inputs and planning, then moving through concept generation and development phases, then a proof of principle, maybe proof of concept might be called, phase, and then getting into detailed design, moving on through pilot manufacture, design verification, and then industrialisation, potentially scale up and launch. As I say, you'll see different terminology used. I'm going to be describing what happens in each phase, so these are the terms I'll be using, but hopefully they'll be familiar to most of you. Another thing I want to talk about really is key relationships. Obviously, it depends. Here's one kind of common example where there are often three organisations working together to bring a product to market. So you'll have the company, the pharmaceutical company, the medical device company, who own almost the core technology, whether that's a drug product or a device technology, and they're going to be the commercial manufacturer of the final product when it goes on the market. There's then a contract manufacturing organisation, CMO, or potentially CDMO, and they're responsible for actual production of the device, which would then be either put onto the market or potentially supplied to the pharmaco, who would then put the drug in. So they are the main manufacturing organisation. And then quite often a development partner, companies like Team, who develop the device from early stages and then transfer that design to potentially CMO, potentially device co, pharmaco, or both. At an appropriate point, and the point of that transfer varies from project to project. These just examples, I think hopefully a lot of what I'm going to be talking about would apply to different kind of configurations, if you like. Sometimes there might just be two organisations, a developer and a device co which also manufactures. But as I say, hopefully most of the points are relevant. So we're going to talk first about CMO selection, just a couple of slides on that. Firstly, when does it occur? It's good to have a CMO in place as soon as possible. If you have a CMO you regularly work with, then that would make sense. But I think it's worth bearing in mind what's going to be most appropriate to your device. Once you've got the nature of your device confirmed and the market, and by nature of device I mean, is it mechanical, is it electronic, is it high volume, medium volume, where are your markets, the US, Europe, etc. What's the sensitivity to cost? It may be that the CMO you already work with or already have in mind might not be suitable for a particular other device. So it may just benefit you to hold on and make sure you're choosing the right CMO for that particular product. Through proof of principle phase, if you've got a good development partner, they should be able to cover some of the core manufacturing issues and make sure that, for example, the concepts that are being selected are going to be robust from a manufacturing point of view. Through detailed design, this is a point where you really ideally are going to have your CMO in place. They will be able to contribute to the DFM. The DFA, that's design for manufacture, design for assembly, and they'll bring their expertise to bear, and you'll also be bringing them on the journey of the design rather than just presenting it kind of as a fait accompli towards the end. So really during this phase, it's going to be good to get the CMO in place, and as we'll see on the next slide, it's actually not a bad time to be getting them involved. Pilot design verification is possible without the final CMO in place. We have done that on projects, but I think it's fair to say it's not ideal. It can introduce risk during design transfer and scale up if you haven't had your CMO involved until after design verification, particularly if any changes are needed. And then obviously industrialisation, that's only going to happen with the chosen CMO in place. Little thought on the process. This is certainly how we've seen it happen in the past. So think about your requirements for your manufacturing partner based on the device in question. Once you have those, you can review options based on industry knowledge, get a short list together of companies you feel may be appropriate, and then obtain quotations for device manufacturing. This is if you can be at that stage where you have an outline of the device, then getting quotes against that device will give you an indication of the likely costs, and also potentially you'll get some good feedback. A good CMO will be providing potentially some comments on DFM, DFA as part of that quotation. You might also want to include a questionnaire for certain aspects of the CMO to get to a shorter shortlist, and then visit them on site. If they've got multiple sites, perhaps the most site that's going to be most applicable to yourselves, review the proposals with them, review the capabilities, and effectively then confirm the selection, get contracts in place. I wouldn't underestimate how long that might take. So again, starting this process at the right point in time is important. And that's, as I say here, one of the possible pitfalls. So thinking about opportunities, getting CMOs involved and getting proposals gives an opportunity for some DFM, DFA input. If you haven't got that, then it is worth thinking about getting design review by a CMO who or manufacturing experts who may not be the final manufacturer of your product, but who will be able to give you expert input. We've certainly done that in the past, gone to speak to auto assembly equipment manufacturers or tool makers, even if they're not going to be providers of the final solutions. They're on a consultancy basis often willing to help and provide very good input that's very worthwhile. The process of selection actually gives a good opportunity to build relationship and ensure best fit. It's quite a good process to go through, and you might find through that process you have a warmer feeling, a better feeling towards certain organisations. And this is the same, as I say, as well as for manufacturing organisations, it's also true for equipment suppliers such as test equipment, assembly equipment. Think about a few possible pitfalls. Don't assume all sites within the same global CMO, the same overall organisation, will provide equivalent service. They've often been brought into an organisation but had separate histories, were independent companies, and then so you do find different capabilities and areas of expertise across different sites of an organisation. Just because it's the same name above the door doesn't mean you're going to get exactly the same thing. Beware if you're sending out competing proposals, you might start off with a common RFQ, but as responses come in, then you may get proposals that aren't covering equivalent solutions and services, so make sure you're bearing that in mind. And then key thing, as I mentioned, is bad timing. Getting CMOs on board too late or potentially too early can damage things. One of the things to think about is the speed. As I mentioned before, development organisations can move very quickly in the early stages of prototyping and concept development. That's not to say CMOs can't move quickly, but sometimes they're better suited to later stage development and production, setting up production systems with a bit less flexibility, a bit less agility. As I say, in cases they can move quickly, sometimes it's just the fact that two companies can maybe move a little bit more quickly than three in terms of decision-making processes. Some of the names here that you see, these are the organisations we've worked with in the past on multiple projects, and this paper really is based on all those kind of interactions. These are CMOs, also equipment suppliers that we've worked with over the years. Okay. So we talked about CMO selection, then I really want to talk through these other core production engineering activities that take place through the development process, and just think about the different roles and responsibilities for these, in this example, 3 organisations as we move through these development steps and these activities. So, as I say, concepts and prototyping, really up to kind of proof of principle, feasibility, that tends to be driven by the development partner, rapid iterations. Often these iterations are taking place even while requirements capture and development is still ongoing. And sometimes these activities happen outside of a formal development program, just as a kind of feasibility study prior to kicking out a full program. That said, even at the concept stage, you need to be thinking about commercial manufacturing, and that has to be considered as part of concept selection and concept development. If you have a CMO in place, then definitely get them involved in the review of those concepts. And also in particular core concepts, sometimes they can be based on a core fundamental either manufacturing principle or process. Maybe it's filling, maybe it's involving novel materials or processing. So again, if that's at the heart of your technology, then definitely you need to be getting expert input into that at this stage. In terms of the design specification, so this is development of things like CAD databases, PDM systems, what templates are you going to use, what reference systems, etc. The design development plan at the start of the form program should capture roles and responsibilities across organizations, but make sure you have those in place. Ownership of the CAD database would normally reside with a development partner. They can handle that development, they can handle the development of the 3D, 2D, and then hand that over during design transfer as appropriate. You do want to agree the strategy for that database though at the start of detailed design, so what kind of CAD, what tools, what templates, what processes for things like design review, change control, change management, etc. You want to make sure you know how you're going to handle those, how you're going to handle software code, how you're going to handle electronics, PCB designs. And you also need to agree on quality specifications, what kind of tool process qualification are you going to go through. You'll understand that better when you have the CMO in place, but it's important how you're going to mark inspection dimensions, how you're going to mark process control dimensions. All of this needs to be agreed with the CMO before final production of these design specs. Risk analysis is obviously a huge strand in the development of medical devices, covering user risks, product risks, process risks. Risk management file produced as part of 14971, generally held by the company who will be commercial manufacturer, Pharmaco, Device Co. The risk management continues post-launch through things like post-market surveillance, so it makes sense for good continuity for them to own that file, although it can often be, a lot of it can be generated by development partners and manufacturing partners. The risk management plan will capture who's responsible for which part of the process and which tools and systems are going to be used. A few key points. So initial hazard analysis will need clinical input, certainly for a medical device, drug delivery device or surgical device, to really understand risk level. So wherever that clinical input comes from, it needs to be secured early on. If the user risk analysis will need to be coordinated with a human factors engineering plan. It's clear within the standards how to do that, but again, if that's happening across two organizations, then make sure you're coordinating that. I think it's fair to say the product or design risk analysis is best driven by the development partner. That organization is likely to be really understanding the design intent, and driving that forward as part of the development of the design, but get the appropriate subject matter experts input into those risk analysis activities as required. Process risk analysis is often best owned by the CMO because they're closer to the manufacturing side. Certainly from team's perspective, we would still want that to include user risks, though. What can arise from manufacturing processes which will potentially impact on user risk, user safety, as well as considering the production side, production efficiencies, etc. In terms of design for manufacture and assembly, it is, as I've mentioned, critical to consider that early on through the concept prototyping phase and then through detailed design phase. Again, a good development partner will have the expertise to apply good DFM, DFA processes and knowledge early on. And as I've said before, if the CMO isn't in place, you can maybe get that input if needed from other sources. You do need the CMO to be involved before completion of detailed design, really thinking about product architecture, assembly processes, material selections. They may have certain preferences there, supply chain, etc. Making sure you've got a good, accurate cost model for commercial supply of the product. So definitely wanting the CMO in place to contribute to these DFM, DFA activities during the later stage of detailed design. Always bear in mind as well that requirements for auto assembly and scale up, you need to be thinking about them early on, because you don't want to need to introduce changes to allow high volume auto assembly solutions. You don't want to introduce changes late on that will implement that. If you can build those features in that you're going to need early on, then that's definitely preferred. Tolerance analysis, this is quite a specific one, but it's very important. it's really, developing the full understanding of the design and how it works and how efficiently it can be put together. It's initially generated, by the development partner, but it needs to be transferable. So think about when you're creating the tolerance analysis, develop it in a way that can be transferred as needed. Often these tolerance analyses start early on as part of looking at key stacks and sensitivities to them, and then they build into a full tolerance analysis for the overall device or system. It's a critical part of design development. Optimizing it supports understanding of what are the critical to quality features, its sensitivity of design performance to them. In whatever system you use, this image here is based on a MathCAD, which is our preferred method of doing tolerance analysis, but you could do it in Excel, you can do it in CTOL. Key thing, it should be statistical, and it should be based on realistic tolerances and process capabilities. You can base that on ISO standards, for example, those ones there for molded parts. So be realistic, apply the realistic tolerances and develop a design which will work to them. Don't apply the tolerances that you need for a system to work. And review with the CMO. You need to make sure you're aligned on what tolerances are achievable with what capability assumptions and what process control and critical dimensions you should be identifying and applying, and what are the implications for inspection systems during production. And keep updating it, keep updating the analysis, including once you get to actual data, production data of tooled parts, then you can compare the actual process capabilities with the ones that you had assumed. Other thing that having a good tolerance analysis supports is reconciliation of parts and acceptance of change late on. If you have tools and during qualification, if you want to relax a tolerance perhaps or shift a dimension, then having a good robust tolerance analysis helps with that decision-making process. Do you want to talk about tooling? So early on, rapid prototype tooling, device developments really benefit greatly from the use of molded parts. So development partners working directly with specialist rapid tool makers is a good way of getting molded parts early. Some CMOs do offer rapid tool making services that can give benefits later on because they will have learned through this early stage tooling and carry that knowledge forward. It can sometimes be slower, so have a think about your options there. The key thing is to ensure you've got the right components of the right quality and quantity for each phase, and you really need to think of a tooling strategy for the full development all the way through to launch and scale up, so you know which tools you'll have when and what you'll use those devices for. Commercial tooling clearly better driven via the CMO in terms of specifying them, procuring them, implementing them, qualifying them, etc. And the owner company, Pharmaco, Device Co, their production, operations, quality functions will be involved at this stage as well. I think the development partner still retains an important role. For example, as I mentioned, as part of final design and reconciliation and signing off to make sure that design intent is maintained. There's quite often a kind of tricky gap in the middle, certainly for high volume products where you don't want to go from rapid tools to full production tooling because that might be very high cavitation. So you may have pilot tooling in between, maybe 1-2 cavity, quite high spec hardened steel tools, perhaps to do a pilot DV. Just be clear in the tooling strategy on where those are coming from. That might be driven by the development partner, that might be driven by the CMO. Think about any potential need for clinical supply from these tools so that you're making sure that all the systems that are put in place will be appropriate for what you need. Make sure you're doing careful planning, again, for what you're going to use these parts for. And it's kind of similar on assembly equipment, talking about jigs and fixtures for putting the devices together. Initially, they'll be produced by the development partner as part of developing the design requirements of fluid, the design's fluid. As you move forward, and you need assembly systems to be more robust, more accurate, more repeatable, it perhaps is a time when you might work with the CMO and specialist suppliers of equipment to develop those, capture the requirements, establish what they are, what are the parts that you've built on them going to be used for, again, as part of an overall manufacturing strategy. Ideally, you won't be investing in high-end assembly equipment until the design is fixed, but timing is often critical, and sometimes the assembly equipment can take a long time. The lead times are long, so you might need to be pushing the button on those even while you've still got design changes in mind. So be careful there, think carefully. Also bear in mind, rigs from development phases do sometimes need to be used during things like design verification testing. not necessarily ideal, but sometimes situations dictate that. So if that's the case, make sure you're planning in the documentation for those rigs, the qualification and validation methods, and things like build quality and maintenance. For test and inspection, development engineers tend to carry out a lot of initial testing of prototypes and subsystems as part of understanding the system, characterizing it, optimizing it. As testing demands progress, the methods and the equipment maturity progresses, you need more robust test methods, perhaps validated test methods, and perhaps semi-automated systems. For example, testing multiple design parameters semi-automatically or automatically. Again, you may at this point be working with specialist suppliers on those types of test equipment. The test methods and equipment for production control will be driven by the CMO. Again, perhaps Pharmaco, Medical Device Co might want to double up on that, so they have similar test methods and equipment on their site as well. That all needs discussing, that all needs planning. Design verification testing is a key point here. It's usually the point where all three organizations are working very, very closely together. It's a critical point in a program. Everyone needs to be working together well during that phase, and that kind of DVT planning includes timing, locations, what is the device integrity, what are the nature of the devices, and how far down the manufacturing processes have you moved, and how far have you developed your systems. Component inspection is often overlooked, but it shouldn't be, because it's very important. Making sure you know what you've put into your tests, and then the ability to inspect product as you head towards production. Rapid tool suppliers can provide early inspection data, so you know what you're testing early on. You can also get input from independent inspection houses for dimensional data as needed. The CMO will develop production inspection systems to support that final process validation and ongoing manufacturing. And don't underestimate the time and resources required for inspection. For example, during late stage troubleshooting, DVT builds, it's often significant and is often underestimated. Finally, think about design transfer. It's not just about handing over, a drawing pack and technical specifications. It's about it's called out in the standards. Both 13485 and 21 CFR 820 have specific sections on design transfer. It's about verifying that the design is suitable for manufacture. It's verifying, make sure those design specifications have correctly been turned into production specifications, and that production controls are capable, and that you can manufacture the product reliably that will meet the requirements. So you need to understand the design, you need to transfer that understanding of the design and communicate it. And this all should be driven by a design transfer plan, so you know what's going to be transferred when and how to make sure the approach is going to be suitable to meet your requirements. There's a kind of one particular implication from the MDR, which is more emphasis on the device constituent part of an overall product, where you have maybe a combination product, which previously made the most focus might have been on the drug side. There's a lot of emphasis on the device side now. One implication of that is that Pharmaco, Medical Device Co, needs to have a good level of understanding of that device to manage submissions, support submissions, reviews, audits, lifecycle management, etc. So the design transfer process needs to ensure that that understanding is put in place. So here's a quick summary. Development of medical devices often involves key relationships. It hinges on those. That's often between three companies. It might be four, it might be two, but relationship between these organizations needs to be good. The more effectively these organizations work together, the higher chances of success. Roles and responsibilities will change throughout the program. They will move across from development partner to CMO, or from development partner to Pharmaco, for example. So communicate and agree who is doing what when, and recognize that they will change, and that change needs to be managed. Similarly with transfer activities, testing, analysis, change control, etc., it all needs to be well planned and managed. And the final point, I'm afraid, each program is different, each collaboration is different, different challenges. So the key thing is flexibility, common understanding. If you're all working together well, then that's giving you the best chance of success.
Someone's asked, what's the biggest challenge you faced during the device development stage?
The biggest challenge, I can think of a few. I suppose particularly thinking in terms of this, these relationships, it's probably late stage change. So needing to change something about the design, about the product late on, maybe during DV or after DV or during scale up, where you've got, excuse me, lots of commitments, lots of time commitments, cost commitments, everything's up against it, and you've also got all of your systems in place, whether that's tools, assembly equipment, etc., and you're having to change something for some reason. Maybe you didn't understand quite how the core technology worked or didn't work, or something changed during scale up. So on the whole, I think when those issues occur, they are the most challenging. There are other smaller examples of communication and team working, etc. But I think when things need to change late on, change something without changing anything is always a challenge.
Another question we've had is, well, do you have any preferred manufacturing partners? Assuming that's here at Team.
We're not aligned to any in particular. We prefer to keep independent. We've worked with, probably fair to say, most of the global organizations, CDMOs that span across Europe and the US on various projects, and we've had good successes with all of those. We've also worked with quite a few independent or smaller organizations, maybe purely based in Europe, UK, or the US. So we keep independent. And that's not just because we don't want to kind of nail our kind of colours to one particular organisation. It's also about making sure that the choice of CMO and supplier is appropriate for the product, because different products have got are better placed with some rather than others for whatever reason, as I mentioned. So we'd rather kind of work with client organisations to find the right CMO for that project and that product.
Excellent. So another question, similar vein. What is the best time to hand over the design to a CDMO?
To hand over the design, it depends. So I think bringing the CDMO in place, early detailed design or late pop kind of phase, for us, if we were just going to ask to do a project plan and propose when we would bring them in place, that's when we would put it on that plan, the end of the proof of concept or early in detailed design. So that might be a case of bringing them in and handing it over at that point. We've certainly done that on some projects where, particularly maybe where the client is, one of the examples I talked about, where the client is a device manufacturer. If they've got everything in-house that they need, then design transfer early and kind of handing it over to production engineers or the QC. So that can happen quite early. If it's more of this kind of three-way relationship, I think transfer of the design probably best happens later, either during DV or afterwards. A lot of the change control, change management systems are in place, and so it's good to work to those and then hand over during either final stages of V&V or between, if you've got a pilot phase, probably between pilot and then scale up. And I think the design transfer at that point, so you're still present, you can still communicate, understanding of how the product works and some of the criticalities of it, but that the CDMO is up and running and get everything in place for commercial production as part of quite a long process. It gives a bit more time to do that. So in that case, probably later on. Post DV, pre-DV, if they can be in place and have everything up and running during design verification, then you will have done. Design transfer doesn't just happen at the end. Design transfer happens part of the way through, and the more that you can do through that kind of that DV part of the process is good. So you might start the design transfer then and then complete it after DV, just before kind of final industrialization or scale up. Excellent.
Thanks for that. So we're getting close to time, but probably time for just one more quick question, which I suppose relates to that. You mentioned the three-way aspect of the relationship. So someone's asked, what would you do if you don't have a CDMO in place and you need to manufacture, for example, for use in the clinic?
And you can. So it doesn't. I think I said it. You definitely want the CDMO in place for industrialization. I think that's you ideally would have. If you don't, it is possible for, say, development partners, such as Team. We have in the past where maybe the client is for some reason is in that gap where they want to get units out either for use in the clinic or maybe to get them into the hands of clients as research tools. the development partner can set up systems for you to provide that kind of stopgap. They're not always necessarily the most kind of best place, in that you then have to hand it over again. You're almost doing the design transfer twice. But I think good development partners will be able to help out, not necessarily manufacturing directly themselves, but using their set of approved suppliers. It's another reason, why might a company not have those partners in place. Well, maybe it's contractual, maybe it's that they haven't reached commercial agreements, maybe they've needed to switch for some reason. So it can occur even with the best will in the world and the best planning, where you suddenly find yourself short and needing a kind of an initial supply, maybe small batches, initial batches to be handled elsewhere. And as I say, either the development partner and the device co working together can probably find the right people to work with, and the development partner will be able to put the systems together. But if you know that's going to happen, then you need to plan for that as soon as possible, in making sure that the equipment is appropriate, everything's qualified, all the documentation in place and the systems in place. You can't just use systems that maybe you used prior to DV. So it's not ideal, but it can be done. Or maybe as well, maybe talking to CMOs who maybe aren't set up to do the full scale manufacture of what your final production volumes might be, but you might be able to find an organization who can help you out for the initial volumes, knowing full well that they aren't going to be the final partner. Again, it's not ideal because you'll then be doing transfer through two organizations, but maybe solutions around something like that might be appropriate depending on the case in question.